Excerpt 1. A day or two into my first retreat with Sangharakshita, a berobed friend from his eastern past paid him a visit. Before leaving, he shared a word with a fellow retreatant. If you've read Sangharakshita's survey of Buddhism, you hold the key to the entire sutra treasure. I was a newbie, so those words meant almost nothing to me. But they alerted me to something I should know. There was more to Sangharakshita than I'd realized. Sangharakshita was aware of the ways people fixed him at different times in his life. According to who it was that did the seeing, I was the English monk, a rabid Mahayanist, a narrow-minded Hinayanist, the enemy of the church, a Russian spy, an American agent, the editor of the Nagabodhi, an impractical young idealist, a good speaker, the invader of Suez, the guru of the untouchables, and so on. More recently, here in England, I have been a good monk, a bad monk, the Buddhist counterpart of the Vicar of Hampstead, the author of the Survey, a crypto-Vajrayanist, a lecturer at Yale, the hippie guru, a first-class organizer, a traditionalist, a maverick, a misogynist, a sexist, a controversial figure, and the enlightened Englishman. Some of those characterizations were even true. He did live a remarkably rich life and manifested in a number of ways. The introverted London child who'd been moored to a bed for 2 years with nothing but books for company died as founder of a worldwide Buddhist movement. It's tempting to begin a shortish book about Sangharakshita with the often repeated line that on reading Madame Blavatsky's Isis Unveiled at the age of 16, he realized he was not a Christian and never had been. And on reading the Platform Sutra of Wei Lang, or Hui Neng, and the Diamond Sutra shortly afterwards, he realized he was a Buddhist and always had been. Wasn't that when things really got going? Weren't they the experiences that defined him and set the course of his life and mission? Why not start the story there? But whose life? Who was the young man in whose mind those insights dawned? What was the raw material? And how might it have influenced the way the insights landed and played out over the next 77 years? Let's just consider a few life events that a young Dennis Lingwood had to deal with. Born in 1925 into a comfortable and happy working-class family, he was misdiagnosed at the age of 8 with a heart condition. Ordered to keep his movements to an absolute minimum, he was confined to bed for such a long period that by the time the diagnosis and treatment came to be challenged, he'd lost the use of his legs and had to learn to walk again. By any standards, that's a fair amount for anyone to deal with. Enough, surely, to mould a few character traits. But what part might such a childhood have played in forming the Sangharakshita who created the Triratna Buddhist order and community? Maybe we should go back, slow things down, and fill in some details. All the same, maybe for Dennis, to add the moral solitude of a homosexual in 1940s England to a somewhat attenuated relationship with a world beyond his own interests and imagination caused hardly a ripple. Whereas most people lived much more in the outer world of sights and sounds than in the inner world of ideas and the imagination, with me, he wrote, it was the precise opposite. Even when the war broke out, he could write, "Living as I did, as much in imagination as reality, I was at that time no less concerned with a war that had been fought 3,000 years earlier than the one in which I was personally involved." He never doubted his devotion to the Buddha or the Buddhist path, and there had been a time in his life when he'd wanted, with an unbearable intensity, to become a monk. But living as a monk in a Theravadin setting came with such a burden of detail: what time of day one could eat, which shoulder should be covered by the robe and which exposed, who sat where, who spoke when. These were matters of great importance. They were considered the best way to live as a true follower of the Buddha in an impure world. They also signalled the continuity of an unbroken lineage, and so confirmed a monk's qualification to make merit for lay supporters by accepting their donations. It was more than a personal idiosyncrasy that had prompted U Chandramani to insist on the correct pronunciation of Pali words during Sangharakshita's ordination ceremony. The details mattered in that world, but how much did they matter in this one? I once asked Sangharakshita how deeply he'd considered the consequences of allowing himself a sex life. As usual, his answer came from a broader perspective. Well, perhaps I could have continued to live a life of chastity, but of course that would have led to a very different kind of order and movement. The fact of the matter was that, good Buddhist though he knew himself to be, he no longer wanted to live the prescribed life of a monk. It was time to relax the tension, see what it would be like and what he might learn if he allowed himself to live differently. Essentially, he was reconfiguring what it meant for him to be a fully committed Buddhist. As he confirmed some years later, it was only after I started having serious doubts about the bhikkhu life itself that I started having a different attitude to the possibility of becoming sexually active. Those doubts and the possibility went along together. In those early years, he was invariably friendly, tolerant and patient, happy to discuss our practice, our love life, our problems, even our LSD experiences. But if you thought he might be interested, impressed even, to hear about a trip you'd taken over the weekend, you'd come away a little chastened. This wasn't because he'd disapprove. Rather, you'd realize even while you were talking that your drug-based experiences were giving you no more than a brief, puny glimpse of the realms he coursed in. He'd give you his attention and then murmur something like, "Well, it all depends on the context," implying that whatever had happened was only useful if it had taught you something. How did it fit into the serious business of life? Was it really such a big deal? Excerpt 8. For Sangharakshita, the Buddhist life, at whatever level and under any conditions, is characterized by one's willingness to take radical steps and by an intensity of engagement. Immediately after the mass conversions in India, a radical step, if ever there was one, he repeatedly reminded Dr. Ambedkar's followers that there could be no such thing as a merely nominal Buddhist convert. To be a Buddhist, he'd say, is to be 100% Buddhist. The scriptures speak of the Buddhist path as being of the nature of a personal invitation. It's something one chooses to take up, consciously and freely, with no sense of obligation or fear. You can't become a Buddhist, he once said, unless you feel free not to be one. So if you've made that choice, what would be the point of being anything less than committed to it and applying it to whatever circumstances you find yourself in?